Good morning. Glad everybody could make it in. Sorry, but if there was any weather confusion. I want to introduce Allison Thomas, who's my teaching assistant, and she's going to be helping out with the class for the rest of the term, and really appreciate your help. So just wanted to give her a chance to talk to you for a minute.
Hi guys, so I'm here to help you guys out. So about the class, thank you. Sorry. How it's going, COVID related questions. If you're sick, please email me first before you email Dr. Kirk, just so that I know and I can help you guys with that. If you guys have any questions about the syllabus, don't hesitate, just reach out to me. I think my email should be to everyone. If you don't have it, just come up to me after class and ask for it. But should be good. That's pretty much it. Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks, Allison.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to try something new too. I got this little microphone here. So there's some people out with COVID and another accommodation or two. To try and help as best I can for them, they have a password, and you guys can see that as well. But they won't be able to hear you if we have discussion. So I'm going to try this new microphone thing out. So Allison, if you have a question or if we have a discussion, she's going to do her best to sprint around this big room and try to get you the mic so that the people online can hear you. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so one of the a couple of people came up to me after last class and said you were struggling a bit with the reading. I'm surprised it took 3 classes or whatever for that to happen. Most of the time it happens on the second class, but it's very common in this course because you're not used to this type of reading. Most of you, some of you are. Some of you have taken philosophy and things like that. You're more used to this type of reading. Those of you that are new to it are finding out that you just can't read like one of those research papers straight through and get it. You just, I think I told you one time when I got to Exeter, I remember my first meeting with my supervisor, she asked me to look at a paper. It was about 17 pages long, I think. It took me a year. So that's at the PhD level, obviously, but I'm not expecting that. But what I'm saying is when you're reading any of these readings, when your brain starts to get confused, just stop. So you give yourself time to think. It's a little bit different. This is not acquisition of knowledge. Remember what I told you the first day of class? I said you already have all the knowledge for this class. It's not about gaining new knowledge necessarily. Yes, you're learning new constructs and things like that. But generally speaking, you have the knowledge to be successful in this class already. It's about learning to reason, learning about how other people reason and things like that in a new way. Okay. And so because of that, I'm going to do an interruption because I realized where we broke last time, and I was getting ready to go into an example, 2 examples to be specific, one in psychology and one in leadership theory, right? Both are related to courses you take in marketing, in leadership, management. Well, you'll see that it relates to everything. So I put together an additional slide deck because I want to make sure that you have these principles down before we move on. You can read that on your own time. This is about cheating in an ethics class. Did everybody hear that? All right. So we're gonna go through these things today. We're gonna review the foundations that we've been talking about the last few weeks. That's why I wanted to do this class special, because I just want to step back a second and give you guys a big picture, right, of what we're trying to do here. Because we're really working with four constructs, if you want to call it that. It's sort of like one group of ethics and then 3 constructs. And I just want to make sure that we're clear on that. And then I'm going to talk about the disengagement of moral self-sanctions, because that's something that's not commonly taught in this course. And I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. This course is sometimes taught by lawyers. They don't, you know, some of them just don't have this kind of training. But I think what you're going to see at the end of this course is it is unique in the way that I'm combining cognitive functioning with things like moral development, moral reasoning, right? And then we're also not just focused on behavioral manifestations, right? We're going all the way back to fundamental beliefs, because that's where the real problems lie today in organizations. So I don't know that I have you reading much Kant in here, but you should at least know who his name is before you run into somebody from Europe or something like that. Because everybody over there, they get taught a lot more about philosophy. Is anybody from the UK or EU? No, just out of curiosity, I always poll to see if anybody's from there, because they normally will take philosophy courses in what we would call high school, and then certainly, you know, their first year, they just call them first years. So you know, they're what we would call freshman year over here. Their undergraduates are usually 3 years instead of 4. But that's what Kant said. He said, in law, a man is guilty when he violates the rights of others. In ethics, he is guilty if he only thinks of doing so. And remember Kant's categorical imperative and lying and things like that? He's going deeper than that. This is sort of like in his metaphysics of morals kind of thinking, where he's thinking like, even if you think about, you know, even if your intention is doing it wrong, it's wrong, right? And Voltaire had, you know, you all probably know who Voltaire is. He had a different point on it. And I always like this quote. It's forbidden to, you know, being a former military officer myself, you know, it is forbidden to kill. Therefore, all murders are punished unless they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets. You know, that one always stuck with me. But we want to go back and look at the major constructs that we're dealing with to make sure that when we get into the practicality of this, that you have this framework and you understand it. So I'm just going to, this is just an additional slide I threw together with some real concise language. So remember, we started with the 4 major categories of ethics. There's really only 3, some people would say. A lot of times contractarianism is couched under consequentialism, because it is a form of consequentialism. But it's so popular these days, this mentality of the social contract, especially in the corporate world, that I kind of pull it apart a little bit so that we talk about it, you know, in a separate way, because this is that kind of mutual agreement on what are values, morals, what is the right, and then we're going to agree on that. But there's a problem with that, and you're starting to recognize the problem with that kind of consequentialist thinking, right? The other type of consequential that's very common. I know we don't have any economics majors in here. I'm very disappointed in that, just to repeat that. I'm just kidding. This utilitarianism has probably been taught in, we certainly had it in principles, right, of economics. So, so you know what utilitarian is, you know our economic system is based in this kind of thinking of utilitarianism. And so it's important to understand that. Then we have the categorical reasoning. Remember, this is Kant, they call it the ontology, right? Just think categorical, right? The categorical imperative, right? It's sort of like a reformulation of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. That's kind of Kant's thinking on that, okay? So just, you know, keep it simple and keep it, we're not going real deep on this stuff. His categorical reasoning is his base, his start point for his whole foundation of ethics. And it relates to other forms of moral reasoning that are in 3 rival versions. And that's why I do it this way. That's why I match up these MacIntyre's sort of historical narrative of these 3 rival versions of moral inquiry. And we compare them to these sort of historical categories of ethics, okay? And then we talked about virtue ethics. And when you think of virtue ethics, think of a person's character. And remember, character is different than an action. Character is something that is over the longer term, right? It's sort of like a pattern. So like if you do something wrong one time, you wouldn't be judging a person's character, you'd be judging that action. If there was a pattern over time, this would be their character. And this is really what Aquinas, Augustine, and Aristotle, and now it's coming, I told you, this is coming back again to be a popular form of philosophical ethics that is being integrated into organizations generally. But it's because of, I think it's because of the failings that we're realizing in some of the other thinking, right? Because we already recognize as we went through those moral dilemmas that there's something wrong with the consistency, right? There's something wrong with the consistency of how we're answering these dilemmas, right? So that's the first thing we have to understand. We're going to talk about these 3/4 categories of ethics, right? And by the way, you can find a million videos and writings and whatever online. Just type in consequentialism, and hit the video button and watch until you get it. If I don't have a lot of reading in those areas for a reason, because they're the 4 major categories. Watch a bunch of those. They have those it'll have like consequentialism in 10 minutes. Watch it 3 or 4 times, and it'll help you figure it out. Okay. Then we're gonna talk about, we already talked about the 3 rival versions of moral inquiry. And those are the other 3 things to recognize, because as we move forward in this course, these are the things that we're going to need to understand, because we're going to put everything in the context of these categories and these constructs. So for MacIntyre, he points out that there are different versions of moral inquiry, and they're not only incompatible, they're incommensurable. In other words, they don't even make sense in the context of each other. And this is important. This is really popular today in applied ethics. It's still more in the world of philosophy, as opposed to, you don't get this very often in a business classroom yet, but it is getting there. Have any of you had to read the book After Virtue for any of your courses here? It's a common undergraduate course, but usually more in the humanities and stuff like that. All right, that's Alasdair MacIntyre's famous first book that he wrote, and then 3 Rival Versions was a follow-on that he wrote many years later. But you got to understand these different versions, and remember we talked about the thinking of people who think in the genealogical tradition, as MacIntyre refers to it, and we're talking there about ethics being more about the situations. It's relativistic, it's subjective. What you believe is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. This kind of thinking. Does this make sense? I mean, it's that kind of mentality, and he goes all the way back to Nietzsche. But you can kind of follow this kind of thinking all the way through to the existentialists like Husserl, Heidegger, and Sartre of more recent times. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, when I was here and I was an undergrad sitting in this room taking Finance 101, if you would have told me I was getting a PhD, I would have a PhD in ethics someday, I would have laughed at you. So you never know. So genealogy is the first one that you have to understand, and the key word that I would link to that is probably relativism. So just think, when you think genealogy, think what's true for you is true for me, what's true for me is true for me, and that's okay, and that's how the right is determined. And so in a genealogical tradition, the right is determined both individually and collectively. But there's a problem there. The problem is the collective, because the collective all has to get on the same page. Okay. Encyclopedia, think of the rational discovery of universal truth. Remember, MacIntyre's encyclopedic tradition is based on those kind of people who sort of think like science will give us the answer, right? And often it does, right? But there's a problem when we try to apply science to fields like ethics and even psychology, which I'll show you next class. We'll go through an example, and I'll show you a very specific thing that I presented. I think that was at Notre Dame on Marty Seligman's work, and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Remember I mentioned the instruments that some of you are gonna take to get jobs and stuff like that, personality tests and things like that. I think after Thursday, you might start thinking, huh, I wonder if those companies are thinking about that, because a lot of them aren't right now yet. And then he has what I refer to as tradition proper, and that's how I'll try to refer to it now, because remember, MacIntyre's a little confusing in TRV, right? If you, I'm sure you've started to read the book, and remember that he speaks of these things as traditions, but then when he also refers to what he calls tradition, but sometimes he doesn't specify it as tradition proper, and it might confuse you. Okay, so what he means by tradition proper is sort of a teleological view of the universe. In other words, we are here with a purpose, and that purpose is available to us to understand in various ways. He cites examples of some people find their purpose through a religion and sacred texts. Other people find their purpose in organizations. Like I was a part of several large government organizations, and people often talk about that when they leave those organizations. You sort of miss the camaraderie and things like that. And I think that's one of the reasons, because it provides you this sort of sense of purpose, right? And remember that tradition is also virtue-based. In his tradition, he's a very, very big fan of some of Aristotle's work. And if you wanted to read something on the side and to be pretty concise, you might like to read it just for relationship purposes. If I haven't mentioned it before, you can check out Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Don't read the whole thing, but chapters 7, 8, and 9 are good chapters on relationships, and I think all managers should read those chapters. They're interesting for both personal relationships and for all kinds of relationships. So, and then there's the third, which is moral disengagement, and that's that thing we talked about last time with things like euphemistic labeling, dehumanization, moral justification. Remember, I used the Nuremberg trials as a lot of examples on that, about how people would wonder. I mean, I think I told you this story. I was sitting with a professor at Oxford, and he asked me, he said, how could somebody kill 600 million people? Or 6 million, yeah, 600 million, 6 million people like that. It doesn't, it doesn't even make sense to me. And I actually started talking to him about some of Bandura's work. And he realized that these were the arguments that you can watch on video. And maybe you'll want to do that. Watch some of the Nuremberg trials and the arguments they use, and you'll be able to put them right into these categories that Bandura has laid out for us, and then you can start to think about, that's how they made sense of it. They felt an obligation, such a strong obligation to this organization, the Nazis, the Nazi Party or whatever, that they were willing to carry out things that they probably morally fundamentally disagreed with, but they had done it anyway. And so Bandura was asking the question, well, why? And he came up with all those different categories, and that kind of gives you about the why, right? And then I added this slide so that yes. He asked if the Stanford prison experiment would fall into that category. Which category were you talking about? Absolutely. I mean, I assume you've seen some of the videos on that and things like that. I've watched them myself. I think I actually used them in this class 10 or 20 years ago. But perfect example. The Stanford prison experiments, if you haven't watched them, watch what happens to people over time. And it doesn't take long, does it? I mean, what was it, like 24 hours or something like that? And they, the prison guards started to abuse the prisoners. I can't remember it exactly. It's been a while since I looked at it. But ask yourself, when you're watching that, ask yourself, how could somebody who was a student just like you, who just volunteered to be a prison guard or an inmate, right? I think that's how it goes. And I don't know if they got to pick beforehand. I don't think they did. I think it was random. Did they? Okay. But you watch that and you wonder why, like how could somebody do this? Like these were like normal people, 24 hours ago. They seemed like rational moral agents. And 24 hours later, they're crazy or something. So, that's a perfect example of what we're trying to understand. And that's why I said this class can affect everything, including looking at things like the Stanford, experiments and things. If you go on to graduate school, you'll see things you haven't seen before. You'll just turn the news on. You're going to see things different. Then we talked about this briefly. I wanted to give you have this slide. It's in the deck. So you need to copy it down. But remember what I said about this slide. And you can see my pointer up there, right? Can they see that? Can you see that? Okay. So remember, we said that in psychology and management theory, leadership theory, especially marketing theory, finance, all of the majors, really. The research, if you look at the research, it's focused on this side of the spectrum of Fishbein and Ashton's theory of planned behavior. See, this is a simple linear model that I like to use because it's really not disputed very much and it's easy to understand. We all have our fundamental beliefs. In this class, we're focusing on our fundamental moral principles and our moral values and things like that, right? Those beliefs turn into what Fishbein and Ashton called attitudinal formation. Okay. And that attitudinal formation then leads to intentions or conative action, the movement towards behavior, right? And then it results in behavioral manifestation. And why did I say that psychology, basically a lot of the humanities and social sciences, I'll say social science specifically, because this is really a social sciences thing. What they focus on behavioral manifestations. Why? Can anybody offer an answer to that? It's because it's something you can observe, right? They want to be a science. In social science, we even have to put science in the word, right? So I'm not beating up on social scientists. I'm a social scientist myself, but we talked about the problem with probability theory, right? Which is what social science is based on. And when you start talking about these theories and the moral components of these theories, that's what causes the problem. It's that they're looking at the behavioral manifestations and making assumptions off observations without understanding the fundamental moral belief systems of the agents or respondents. And in research we call them respondents or subjects that are involved. Does this make sense? Any questions? Okay. So this sort of ties. I'm trying to tie it together here by showing you something. When I first started trying to understand ethics by understanding moral development in psychology, in developmental psychology, what I found, I ran into, Lawrence Kohlberg's student, James Rest. He passed in 1999, but he has at least 4 colleagues that have continued on with the research. And they came up with these 4 different ways that they would sort of like look at moral development: moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, moral character. The one that they thought they could measure was moral judgment, because what they constructed an instrument that asked people questions. People would answer those questions, and then they would gauge whether or not those questions were at a certain reasonable level based on, now this is important, based on their rationale. Okay. Remember, I said McIntyre wrote another book called Whose Justice, Which Rationality? I mean, the title itself gives away the problem, right? Somebody has to decide what right is. And it took me a long time to figure out what they meant by moral judgment. And it took me a longer time to figure out what was wrong with the instrument that they were using to measure moral judgment. And I won't get into that now. I just want you to know that this is kind of what's going on out there. When I realized the problem, I'm a little slow sometimes, I suppose, or something, because I had to do 2 PhDs. On my second one, I started studying philosophy, and I realized that the problem wasn't in the observations or the statistics, because that's where I was focused. You know, I was coming out of here, economics, sort of the statistician mentality. And that's what I'm thinking. I'm looking for the problem in the statistics when the problem was really in the philosophy. And that's why I added moral understanding is what I used to call it. I think I called it in a paper a long time ago. I referred to it as moral understanding. And this goes to the last slide of beliefs. So you can kind of look at what they were looking at was moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, moral character. They were asking questions about those things, but they weren't asking questions about, well, wait a minute, let's make sure that we don't have incompatible or incommensurate, to be more precise, rival versions of moral inquiry. Because if we have that and we're using the same instrument, do you see the problem? Not only from the respondent side, but the theorists themselves often don't recognize this issue. And so they just construct an instrument. Most of the time these days, they're mashing together 2 of these things, which is genealogy and encyclopedic thinking, because they want to do science, right? But then they want to generalize it. And when you take that to the moral level, the problem should become obvious. The problem is that when you move from, it's moving from is to ought. This is like an example of the is ought problem. In other words, just because you're observing something and something is doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's what it ought to be. Make sense? So in moral development, and the reason I'm bringing in moral development here is because this is something that organizations actually measure. I've been in organizations where they used an instrument called the DIT2, Defining Issues Test, and they try to measure these different things. So let me just give you a little background from the perspective of psychology. So Freud focused on moral emotion, and I don't want to get into Freud here too much, but just think about his focus on emotion in psychology. That has come back around in ethics. There's a lot of writings out there these days on that ethics are based in feelings and emotions and things like that. And in fact, it's to the point where a colleague of mine who we're developing I developed a theoretical construct and we were missing a component to measure. He's over in the UK finishing up a 3-year project on developing an instrument to measure to put people into one of those categories of 3 rival versions, but he's not sure whether or not he's going to add an extra one or not, which is based on emotions and feelings type of moral thinking, because it's very popular these days. He and I and some other colleagues have had long discussions on this, so I won't get too much into it. I just want you to know that it's out there. People are talking about it a lot. A lot of people think it's foolish. Because you can kind of go all the way back to Aristotle to see arguments against that kind of thinking, but it was very popular, and it has become popular, a little popular again. Then we have cognitive developmental theory. That's what I just talked about. It started with Piaget, then it went to Lawrence Kohlberg, and then James Rest, and then his colleagues that are still alive, Mickey Babu, Darcy Navarez is at Notre Dame. Mickey's up at University of Minnesota. So he's got these colleagues that are still trying to work on this theory. I've moved on from that, but there are still people that are out there using that. Then we have Bandura's work, and it comes from his social learning theory or social cognitive theory, SCT, and that's where we get Bandura's moral disengagement from. So we have some things here. There's many constructs. They're often ambiguous, utilizing different criteria from different disciplines. That's the first thing to realize. That's, you know what? If you're confused right now, that's probably a good thing, because even the experts are confused. Okay. So don't worry about the confusion. It's about making sense of why why this confusion exists and what we might be able to do about it. Okay. And then there's this other problem of working in a pluralistic society where we're really focused on, it's really focused on relativism and sort of subjectivist type of ethics. And I think we understand the problem with that now. It's that moral relativism may be necessary, but it's not necessarily moral for the agent, for each of you. This is why I say, you know, some of you may wind up in jobs that something doesn't feel right about it. You know, you're doing something that just is against your moral principles. And I can give you a whole list of the kind of jobs that I've run into people over the years with my research. You know, and some of them you wouldn't imagine. Everything from people working in hospitals to people working in finance. Big finance guy. I remember talking to this guy from Goldman Sachs. You know, just about this problem. The problem that he had with his own moral schema was conflicting with the job that he was being asked to do, and he felt very trapped. You know, and so we talked about that, and maybe I'll get into that discussion some other time. So social learning theory, or otherwise referred to as social cognitive theory and moral behavior. The social learning theorists have focused on the behavioral component of morality. So they focused on that behavioral manifestation all the way at the end of Fishbein and Assen's theory of planned behavior, right? Moral behavior is learned in the same way that other social sciences are learned, through vicarious learning and reinforcement punishment principles, and there's an agentive perspective. So that means an agentive perspective means that Bandura, when we talk about Bandura and his moral disengagement, he's not talking about it from an organizational perspective. He's talking about it from an individual perspective. Okay, he's a developmental psychologist. This is the connection I want you to make. That there's conflicts between the philosophy and the psychology in applied ethics, organizational ethics, business ethics, professional ethics, whatever you want to call it. Okay, there's conflicts there, and people haven't recognized those conflicts, and they're just starting to come out. That's why I had you read the first 2 papers or 3 or whatever it is about this argument from a leadership studies perspective, and then we're working on. I've been working on the theory for 2 years now, and I have a draft of it, and Jim's working on the construct to finish out measuring this linear model that we've developed. So, moral behavior. In social learning theory, they believe that moral behavior is strongly influenced by situation, environmental, and organizational aspects. What does that sound like? Something else we were talking about. Remember the different categories? Remember 3 rival versions of moral inquiry? What does that sound like? Sounds like a genealogical perspective, doesn't it? Or genealogy, right? As McIntyre calls it. These are the connections I want you to start making, okay, between these things. Due to organizational influence, what we do, moral performance, is not always reflective of our internalized values and standards. Okay, this is what I just talked about. This is why I think this class is so important. It's because people pay later on in their lives for things that they don't think that they're going to have to pay for, and it's because they're going against their own moral principles to accomplish something, and they're using arguments like consequentialist thinking. In other words, they're thinking about the consequences. If I just do this job, I'll make enough money to be able to buy the nice car I've always wanted, or to be able to have a family, or to be able to, support my parents that are sick or something like this. You see what I mean? Like, there's all these reasons that people use, right? Gradual disengagement of moral self-sanctions. Behavior normally viewed as immoral, even reprehensible, becomes more benign, acceptable, or worthy in a particular social setting. Think about the Nazis. Now, there's two aspects you can look at that. But I have one that I think I wrote about. If you've ever heard of the Einsatzgruppen squads, the death squads that they used to send out, and they were shooting people at close range, right? And they were becoming alcoholics. There was a lot of psychological distress going on. And remember that the reason that Bandura, the psychologist, and myself and McIntyre use warfare a lot is because it's very visible. It's easy to see. But what I need you to do is I need you to realize that these things happen just in a different way in other types of organizations. And they can have the same end result, which is what's most concerning to me and why I'm so passionate about this research. Because our research has already provided evidence that when people disengage from their own moral self-sanctions, over time, that can cause cognitive dissonance. That cognitive dissonance can lead to self-harm up to and including suicide. That's how important this is. It's happening today. And it's not just happening with people that have certain types of jobs. We hear a lot of it about, military and things like that. But this is rampant in other communities too. Police officers in the UK. I remember meeting with a chief of police over there years ago, talking about this with him, and him realizing that this is happening in his organization. So there's all kinds of ways you can apply this. Stock market crash. Remember, I'm sure you've read the history books, right? Stock market crash. What were some people doing when the market crashed? Jumping out of a building. Why would they do that? You see, like this is the kind of thinking they got to think. Well, why? It meant that much to them, or what was going on in their head? That's where I'm talking about the cognitive dissonance component. Moral behavior through self-regulation. So Bandura, now remember, Bandura, think Bandura, moral disengagement, okay? Moral disengagement. He emphasizes that moral cognition is linked to moral action through self-regulatory mechanisms that involve these things: monitoring and evaluating our actions, disapproving of our actions when we contemplate doing wrong, and approving of ourselves when we behave responsibly or humanely. So Bandura is providing a bit of a solution here. The problem is do people actually use it? Do they actually monitor and evaluate and self-reflect? Okay. I know, how should I put this? I can't remember if it was Aristotle or Plato, but basically said that there's no such thing as don't take this personally. There's no such thing as a young, wise person, because it takes two things to become wise in Aristotle's view. It was Aristotle. It takes oh, sorry. What did I say? Take two things to become wise. This is too many TBIs over the years. It takes knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge, right? And experience. And then making sense of those two together. Which part do young people lack? Experience, right? So now what he refers to as young and not young, I mean, that's where we can kind of have a debate about what that really means. I mean, I don't think he meant like an age, okay? That's not what he meant. You can be, people talk about me all the time, like I turned 50 last year, and people look at the career that I've had, and Allison said something to me earlier before a class, and I said, yeah, I said, my Nana said, Kirk doesn't let the grass grow under his feet. So when I was 18 years old, I was like, let's go. I'm gonna go. I'm doing it. And I went as hard as I could, beat my body all up. When my body was done getting beat up, I went to my brain, and so I started studying, and now I got short-term memory loss. So I don't know. You figure it out. But the point is he was sort of like making a point. It's like not just your experience, because we all know lots of very senior people in their 70s, 80s that would you consider them wise? Think about people like that. No, well, in that case, they haven't acquired the knowledge to make sense of the experience that they had. That's what Aristotle would say. Does this make sense? Okay. Moral behavior through disengagement mechanisms. Now, some of this we went over last time. I'm just trying to give you additional resources to look up these things and try to understand them a little better. Bandura suggests that mechanisms of moral disengagement allow us to avoid self-condemnation when we engage in immoral behavior, even though we know right from wrong. That's the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial. That's the Stanford prison experiment, and it happens every day at work. Yes. Platoon. He was asking if in Vietnam, if moral disengagement was taking place there, right? For the people online. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Bandura uses warfare so much, because it's there's so many things that happen in warfare that just, I mean, I could tell you stories that I did not expect. When I got to Afghanistan in 2002, I was not ready for what I walked into over there. And I wasn't mentally prepared to deal with what the difference in sort of the morality of the society and the things that were going on. I'm just being honest with you all, so I hope you respect this. I felt like I was very much prepared for how women were treated, because I had seen it on TV, watched the movies, read the books, The Bear Went Over the Mountain, and all this stuff about the history of Afghanistan. And so I was ready for that in a way, although it's funny how these things work out, because years later I used to have this like reoccurring nightmare about something that seems sort of benign, but it was in a market, and a woman was in her burqa, and she was being beat by her husband, and I wanted to intervene, but the rules of engagement wouldn't allow me to do that, and I almost did anyway, but two of my friends pulled me aside or whatever. So and years later that affected me. Like, I thought about that a lot. And so these are the things, like, you just don't understand sometimes. But the other thing over there that I remember specifically was the children. And I won't get into it, but you can look it up online and see about how some of the Mujahideen commanders value children, and it's not pleasant. And it's something that when I experienced it firsthand, it was not something that I was ready for. So I think that's why warfare is used so often, is because I could just go on. It was like almost every day. When you're in a combat zone like that, and you're out running missions, you're just at the time you just feel like you're trying to stay alive, do your job, all these things, and those, to me, those wound up being mechanisms for disengaging from my own moral self-sanctions. You know what I tell people these days? I started up when I graduated from here. I was commissioned in the Medical Service Corps. I was in my first job when I got the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg. I command a platoon of airborne medics, paratroopers. They were medics. I probably should have kept that job, but I was 26 years old, full of testosterone, wanted to go conquer the world, wanted to be James Bond or whatever. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. And so I requested the transfer to intelligence, and it drastically affected my life. So I just tell you these stories because I care, and I don't want you to make some of the what I consider mistakes. Would I do that over again? No, I would not. But I wasn't thinking like this back then. I didn't think that those outcomes would be what they were. So that's one of the reasons why I love teaching this class so much, because it allows me to talk about these things. So here's some of the, you have these slides, so take a look at them. It gives you a little bit more clarity on the different aspects, like moral justification, making it socially worthy, right? This was the whole, like, I hate keep bringing up the Nazis, but Bandura writes about this a lot, with like the Kristallnacht, and how could people just turn on a whole, society like that. Well, they had moral justification. And we talked about some of that last time about how they did that more specifically. They used other mechanisms too. The Nazis pulled out, what's his name? The propaganda minister, Goebbels. Goebbels, he pulled out the kit bag on moral disengagement, didn't he? I mean, he really went at it. We talked about euphemistic labeling. Remember, like I think I used the military the last time as an example for that, right? It's like, they don't. The Air Force calls it servicing the target when they bomb a village, and and we in the Army and Marine Corps, we tended to call it eliminating the threat or something to this effect, right? So it's like flowery language. We talked about displacement and diffusion of responsibility. Remember, displacement. We're just carrying on our tradition. We're just doing what we do, right? That's displacing this onto society, as an example. Diffusion of responsibility, a little bit different. Groupthink, avoidance of individual responsibility and/or accountability. This is that. Remember, we're going to come back to that. Remember that dilemma that we talked about. We talked about the dilemma with the people sitting around the boardroom trying to decide whether or not they should donate to the United Way, which we were just assuming that they give money to Planned Parenthood. I don't know if they do anymore. I just use that as a real world example. And whether or not we should track the employees who do and don't, right? And we realized that there could be a moral dilemma there. And then how does that work in the organization? What if I'm one of those senior vice presidents sitting around the table trying to make that decision? And I have very strong beliefs in the one hand, how could that affect me? So see, it's not only the senior vice president sitting around the table that are affected, it affects all the employees all the way down, right? Disregard, distortion of the consequences. I don't think I spent a lot of time on this one, but that's why I have these extras in here. We're good at hiding pain, emotion, or otherwise, like that wasn't that bad, right? Something tells me they don't still do this, but back when I used to play football, and there's blood running out of my nose and there's blood all over my white shirt. That actually happened to me one time because it was the next year I wore a bar down the center, but I was in the pile and somebody punched me through my face mask, because it just had the bars coming down here and it broke my nose. And so there's blood and I was wearing our whites. So there's all this blood down my shirt and I go run off the field and coach grabs me. He's like, your nose is broke. He's like, go see, go see the trainer. So I go run back to the trainer and I tell him to just shove 2 pieces of cotton, those cotton things, shove them up my nose. I go back, I still got blood all over me. Coach looks at me and he's like, are you hurt or are you injured? Has anybody heard that in sports? They still say stuff like that? They do. So Allison was I don't know if you know Allison, but she was a volleyball player here at WVU, and now as a graduate student. So there's some other things that her and I have already talked about with sports that's in the news these days that could be an interesting discussion later on once we get these fundamentals down. We talked about dehumanization. Now, I wrote this before COVID. That's interesting though, right? Masks, costumes, et cetera. Because when I was thinking of that, I was thinking of masks in a different way. But if you think about how masks, maybe we'll just talk about it next time a little bit. Think about if you think that the wearing of masks allows people to dehumanize other people in any way. I haven't put a lot of thought into it. So just throw it out there. See what you guys think. We talked about some of the language. At West Point, they call this plebes, right? There's all kinds of, ways of dehumanizing people with language. If I ever do something like that with a pronoun or something like that, please know that I'm not doing it on purpose, and then come and talk to me and I'll try not to. Some things just get ingrained in us after a while, but so, we had, what do we call them in the military? We call them like newbies, right? We have all these names and they're, it's kind of like these people are sort of like less valuable. You mentioned that movie Platoon. In Platoon, there's a part in there where they talk about the new guys and their life isn't worth as much because they haven't put their time in yet, right? See, that's a form of moral disengagement, right? By the way, I wonder if you could think of ways that you could apply that to your discipline. That question right there about dehumanization and the perception of newcomers. Just think about that. Attribution of blame, that's where we just blame it on the victim. If they just not done this, or if they just done this, we wouldn't have had this problem when you were the one that really caused the problem. Do you see what I'm saying? Actually, what Bandura is saying. And I've added these links in here for some videos you can watch and things that help you out a little bit. So we have some complexities here. And this is what we're trying to figure out. This is why some of you, I hope, are confused now, but will find great joy later on when this starts to all come together and you start seeing things in a different way. So we have these warring disciplines. We have the psychology camp, but even within psychology, there's warring disciplines. I think I mentioned them. We have the humanistic psychology movement, the positive psychology movement, which I've written about actually, the positive psychology movement and the problems with positive psychology. And then there's things like the Christian counseling movement and things like that. And so there's divides even within the fields, much less when you look at the psychology camp. Remember, they're driven by the observation, the behavioral manifestations. In philosophy, one person's bias is another person's reason. How many classes do you all go into where one of the professors uses the word rational as if we just all assume that we mean the same thing by that? Anyone have that happen? Do you see now why that could be a problem? That's why I won't have you read that book, because it's about 3 inches thick. But McIntyre wrote extensively on this problem of whose justice, which rationality. And then we have this professional ethics camp. That's what I'm supposed to be doing in here, right? We're supposed to be doing applied ethics. Well, I think you're starting to feel the problem. You can't do applied ethics if you don't know anything about ethics, right? Or moral psychology. How are we supposed to apply something that we haven't learned? So that's why I'm taking more time up front to get these foundations down so that we can get into the pragmatics later on in the term. Remember, I said we're taking a journey. So then we have issues of evaluation. And I've already alluded to some of this. What is good for the individual may not be good for the society. This is part of what it's referred to as Rawlsian justice, or sometimes distributive justice. And I actually put a link on there so you can read on in the Stanford Encyclopedia. There's a whole page on distributive justice. And I think if you just read that page, you're going to see and just think about the name of the book that I gave you. Whose justice, which rationality? Read that and see if you see any problems. Okay? Just read that one page on distributive justice. Think about the question of rationality is a good term to think of as you read it, and see what you think. Applying evaluation criteria should address the following: where influence ends and coercion begins. That's a difficult thing to answer. It's not always as simple as it looks, and it happens every day in the business world. Remember, in the business world, a lot of times we're focused on a utilitarian mentality, right? And so that can cause issues when we're speaking about things like coercion, right? Because if the organization, corporation, whatever it is focused on the corporate good, remember that sounds a little bit like the greater good. If it's focused on those things, what about the individual? Well, we've already recognized the problem with that. There's no way that we're going to get everybody on the same page in an organization when it comes to moral, their moral foundations. Not only do we all, remember I pointed out this, not only do we all have different moral schemas, but many of us have different foundational moral principles, okay? And the problem becomes when we try to apply them in a pluralistic organization. That's what I basically just said with the second one there, the determination of values and relation to beliefs, right? This is one of the problems when we're evaluating things. Think of yourself around that boardroom table. Okay, because we're going to come back to that on Thursday. Okay. Recognition of multiple stakeholders, this plurality, this is part of the problem, the pluralistic nature of organizations. Okay, so how do we get around this? Now, don't look for the answer, because right now there's not one. I'm working on it. I'll get the paper. I'm trying to get the paper out this summer. But even the answer that I have, quite frankly, I'll just be honest with you, it's not completely satisfying. It's sort of like it's the best we can do, you know, kind of thinking. And there's a lot. There's other people that have written on sort of how to deal with. This is really comes to McIntyre's problem of these incommensurate moral traditions. How do we live in a society together? How do we work in a corporation together when we have when people have incommensurate moral traditions? You see, this is the big problem he's trying to point out. And then we have the problem with measurement criteria and validity. And remember, I talked about Karl Popper and bringing up the problem of probability theory. And so I think most of you probably had statistics 101. You probably had, at least when I was here, it started off with probability theory at the beginning of the class. And in that you can see, and Popper points out the problem with that. As theories are built with that, there's always that error term at the end. And we just we call them outliers and we do away with it. Except when we're talking about organizations and moral agents, individuals, humans, people, we're talking about that. And now we're going to treat them as the outlier. Well, what if your confidence interval leaves you with that 5%? And 5% could be a lot of people in an organization, and you just completely missed them in the research, right? Do you guys see what I'm saying? So I think that's the problem with the measurement criteria and validity. And this goes to a lot of things that you will see throughout your career, whether it has to do with taking, I remember before I went to work for a consulting firm, they made me take has anybody ever taken the Stanford test in here? I remember it was a weird test. It's like an IQ test. You have to like draw pictures of bicycles and stuff. It's really weird. But that was one of the things that they used. Now I've not evaluated that instrument. I don't know, you know, if it relates in any way. I'm just saying that companies are using instruments. I mean, here's a good ethical dilemma. Companies are using instruments like personality trait instruments that may be flawed, by the way, and they're using them to make hiring decisions. What do you think about that? It could be a problem, right? I mean, if the instrument is even correct, you know, should the company be making decisions based off of a personality instrument? You know, and usually those are the instruments that you take, you know, as part of your application. And then basically you know, it's an algorithm, and if you fall below something, you're out. You don't get the interview call back. Just out of curiosity again, how many of you have taken things like this for internships? You're going to have to take them probably for internships and things. So a lot of you have already taken these kind of things. And don't be thinking about this when you're taking those instruments, because you're not going to change the system that way. Just, you know, do what you got to do. Just know that, you know, I'm trying to get you to think that someday you're going to be the one deciding whether or not you should use that instrument to hire people. That's what I want you to be thinking about. So how does moral disengagement relate to your discipline? Now, I think we have every major in here except economics, right? There are no econ majors in here. Okay, so I'll speak to that one because that was my undergraduate major. And then I'm going to ask if I can have a volunteer to think of an example of how it might relate to your major. Okay, I'm going to ask you. For economics, I think the problem for me was the entire discipline was built in utilitarianist thinking, utilitarianism, the greater good. That's what's right. That's what I was taught. And I had, at the time, I had no idea that it conflicted with that notion, sometimes at least conflicted with my moral principles. And I didn't understand why. I didn't even understand that utilitarianism was a part of philosophy, quite frankly, because they didn't make us take philosophy courses here. Not many anyway. I think I might have taken one. So, in economics, that's always been like an issue for me, because most economic theory, most, think of, I wrote I don't know if you still have to do this here, but I had to do a senior thesis here. I think maybe only econ majors had to do it. I'm not sure, but mine was on game theory. And game theory is based in a utilitarianist type of thinking. And I remember being like so impressed with game theory. And I'm not sure, like how I feel about it now. I certainly would struggle with it on an individual level. I can put it to you that way. So that's an example from economics. Who would like to give an example from your discipline that you can think of? And if you want to give a specific, that would be helpful too. Like maybe like a circumstance where you can think of where they utilize euphemistic labeling or dehumanization or something in a field that's your major, like accounting, marketing, management, or finance. And Allison will come around and bring in the microphone. Can I get someone to volunteer?
There you go.
Okay. So I'm an accounting major, and I'm in auditing and fraud at the moment. And we've been doing a lot of like case studies, and in it, there's a lot of things where they justify fudging the numbers or committing fraud. And they're saying like, oh, it's like, I'm really struggling financially. Like I need to like put the money over here just to get by. And so they justify their life being bad to make a bad decision.
Yeah, that happened on a big scale. I can't imagine that you haven't gone through that, at least if you're an upper class. One of the issues is related to that is usually they talk about Enron in this class. I did away with that years ago, right? But that was like a huge failure. Most of you have heard of the Enron scandal and all that stuff that went down. That's what caused the Sarbanes-Oxley. Yeah, I don't know if they can hear something. Yeah. That's what caused the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, to really kind of take place. And then actually later on, when I went to work for Deloitte, was one of the consulting firms I worked for. They were directly affected by that because they were one of the firms that was forced to split. Like remember they split Accenture. Well, what was Accenture? It was Anderson Consulting, and then they split it into Accenture Consulting and Accenture Auditing. Right. This is what you're talking about. The conflict, some of the conflicts that occur there. That's good example. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Anybody else like to volunteer something from your major? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So I'm in supply chain management, and I currently am a supply chain intern. And so what you see with these current shortages and everything that we're dealing with is you still have the pressure to keep your lines running and get your products out, but not always are you going to find a supplier that has your ethical standards that you're supposed to uphold. So you ask yourself, is that right? Do I really need to get my product out? Does that make sense to me? Is that correct? When you have that weight on your shoulders to get that product out and fulfill those responsibilities.
Great example. And that you used there in that example was pressure. Right? We're in jobs and we feel pressure for all kinds of different reasons. But in this case, we're feeling pressure. That was your word. That could maybe be coercion, depending on if you're a manager or whatever, right? Depending on what your position is, So there's these economic pressures that are affecting the supply chain right now, and maybe causing people to send out subpar parts or do things that they wouldn't normally do. That's a good example, great example. What was your major again?
Supply chain.
Supply chain, yeah. Sorry that I don't have that up there as a separate major.
Gotcha. Okay. Oh,
Sorry,
that's you. No,
yeah.
it's okay. I gotta get my stuff.
So I'm in energy land management. So a lot of my job, I work with like legal paperworks, and a lot of it has nothing to do with what's just legal. So like with land leases and even dealing with deeds, a lot of it's based off a notice and who's the most innocent party, even if the person who caused to have a most innocent party was in the wrong. It doesn't matter that they're in the wrong. What matters is like who's gonna have the outcome of gaining a lease or anything else. So I don't even look at right. I just look at who's most innocent anyway for an outcome. So it's never about the action, it's about the reaction.
I could think of that might be familiar with, but I think a couple years ago, I don't know if back to they found something out of the waterfront
With the coal, or they were trying to if you're talking about whenever they were trying to do something with the rail trail, they wanted to do like some type of coal. I think they wanted to do surface mining down there, some type of entry into the coal. And it would have had to go over the rail trail, but they had some type of legal like land estate with the university, and they weren't allowed to have any type of easements over the rail trail. So they weren't able to actually get into a coal mining position from what they were trying to do.
I'm not sure if this is the same one, but it's something where there was, I think it was a restaurant or a business that was down the waterfront and had to give up a certain part of its land and all that legal terms.
Eminent domain, like whatever they can back. They have to, if they legally, they can just give you the land amount for your land. and
Okay.
even, like, acres.
Right. Who's justice, which rationality, right? But you just brought up a good point, and this is what I think is part of the great dilemma that we face. It is so easy to get into a job and to just follow the law, or I used the example earlier, the rules of engagement, right? It's so easy to do that and look the other way. In fact, Bandura talks about that with the Nazis. They had all kinds of laws too. Were those laws just? Were they right? Were they good? They were the law. That was some of the defense in the Nuremberg trials. I was just following the law. I was following orders, right? And so remember what I said the first day in class? This is not business law, but great point, because that is exactly the type of dilemma that you will face. And sometimes you're put in a position, especially earlier on in your career, where the decision to stick to your own moral principles will be very difficult, because it could wind up costing you the job at the end of the day. I actually had the head of Marine Corps Intel. I was talking to him. It was he later became head of the DIA, General Vincent Stewart. And I remember we were talking about this ethics program that I was helping with Marine Corps Intel. And I was leading the development of this new leadership program, and there was an ethics component to it. And we were talking about some of these things. Some of this was part of the curriculum. And I remember General Stewart saying something to the effect of, Kirk, if I actually implement this, I may lose a bunch of Marines. And I think my response was something to the effect of, well, maybe they shouldn't be the Marines that you want anyway. Maybe they shouldn't have been recruited in the first place. Maybe it's good that you lose them if this causes them those kind of problems, because otherwise you could be hurting them in the long term. And it was an interesting discussion, but it was certainly not an easy thing for either of us to reconcile. Does anybody else have one that maybe we missed up there? I think that's the one.
Here we go.
All right. My major is finance, and often I've read some things about when like a large investing firm will short a company that's failing. And I don't remember like the specific language they used to justify it, but I just remember thinking that they were using language that would make themselves live with it and at night when they went to bed. You know what I mean? Like they were justifying it horribly. An acquisition.
Try to think of these things as separate things that go together as one. And then in the next class, we're going to pick up with an example from leadership theory. So make sure you peruse that paper that we have. It's called Understanding Challenges to Leadership as Practice, I believe. That will help you for the next class. And we'll discuss specific examples, and I'll show you a specific example on an instrument that is currently being used in corporate America that's based in psychology, okay? And I'll also show you a leadership theory and the problem there. And that one was even admitted to by the theorist himself. So that's what we'll do on Thursday. I hope to see you then.